Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a new edition of the joint Heidelberg Astronomical Colloquium. And today we're going to move our focus onto the interstellar medium, having looked at compact objects and stars previously. And most particularly, we're very honored to welcome a local speaker, Kathryn Kreckel, who has over the last 10 years been one of the main movers in observational studies of the interstellar medium. Of course, the interstellar medium is more difficult to observe than stars, and so it's particularly important that you get good data on local, well-resolved galaxies, and that has really been the focus of Kathryn's career to date. She started off, did her PhD in Columbia University with the supervisor Jacqueline Van Gorkum. So she started off in radio astronomy, looking at neutral hydrogen. It must have been with Jacqueline, right? Mm-hmm. Actually looking at void galaxies at that time. But thereafter she came to Heidelberg and to Eva Schinner's group at the Max Planck Institute for Astronomy, and she moved out into different emissions from the interstellar medium, in particular dust emission and emission from cooling lines of the interstellar medium, which you see in the infrared. And she was very influential within the Kingfish project, which was the Herschel continuum and spectroscopic imaging at high angular resolution at that time of a few arc seconds actually in the far infrared, which was very good going at that time for the interstellar medium. And during her time in Heidelberg, she also moved into observations in the optical bands of the interstellar medium through combined spectroscopic and imaging observations with integral feed units. In 2019, Kathryn became a group leader in an Emmy Noether group in the ARI Institute in the university. And one of the main, and this group is entitled, what actually is it? We just discussed this. It was the baryon, it was observing the baryon cycle at high angular resolution. So this was basically meaning moving on to VLT imaging spectroscopy, and that's, I think, going to be part of what Kathryn's going to be telling us about today. But she's also doing a lot of other things down. For example, she is also a survey scientist in the SDSS-5 local volume mapper. So that's also integral feed unit observations. So without any further ado, I will leave the floor to Kathryn, who is going to tell us about mapping the ionized interstellar medium in nearby galaxies. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thanks, Richard, for this introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to present some of my work and some of my early results from my new research group here at ARI. So the interstellar medium, the ISM, is comprised of the gas and the dust that exist between the stars. And while it's a small amount of a component of any galaxy by mass, it's really central to the cycling of baryons. The physical conditions and the dynamics that are affecting the ISM can act to either trigger or suppress star formation. And the ionized component in particular is really crucial for tracing different sources of radiation and mechanical feedback mechanisms, providing insights into the physical processes that are shaping the evolution of a galaxy disk. So what you can see in this beautiful optical three-color image of a well-studied nearby galaxy, GC628, we can see this familiar typical view of a spiral disk in a galaxy. But this is looking mostly at the stars, and that's not the whole story about a galaxy. So if we zoom out, we actually can shift our focus from looking at the stars to looking, for example, at the atomic hydrogen gas in the galaxy. And we see that stellar component sits within an extended reservoir of hydrogen, which can serve as a fuel for future generations of stars. But the most direct component related to the next generations of stars forming is actually the molecular gas component, which is much more centrally concentrated. And if we zoom back in, we see that this sort of bulk view of the molecular gas that's available in a disk, when you look with high angular resolution with a telescope like ALMA, you see that this breaks down into a population of compact sort of clouds. These giant molecular clouds then are really sort of the basic unit of the future of star formation in the disk. So you see that this in this galaxy, that even this molecular gas is organized into a spiral pattern, which it can agree sort of in general sense with where we see the sites of massive star formation here traced through their H-alpha emission. But the agreement is not completely one-to-one. If I step back and forth, there's some interesting differences between where we see the raw materials and where we see the current massive star formation. And so this has important implications then for how the gas and the star formation connect, and that has some interesting implications for its dependence on galaxy environment and dynamics, which I'll get into later in this talk. When we look with even deeper resolution, deeper imaging, tracing those ionizing photons impacting the surrounding gas, we see that those compact regions of associated with star formation, those H2 regions, are actually sitting within an extended ionized gas field, tracing much more interesting large-scale features in the diffuse ionized gas throughout the disk. So this complicated picture of all of these different gas phases coexisting within the disk and interacting with the stars that are forming and the stars that are ending their life is all part of this understanding of how baryons cycle through their different phases in the galaxy and in the ISM. So we move from sort of more diffuse atomic gas that condenses into this molecular phase, which can then collapse, form stars, they ionize their surroundings, remove a lot of that sort of natal material, and then the stars in their end phase through supernova explosions can return much of their material and their energy and their enhanced metal content back into that large-scale ISM. And in particular, the physics of the feedback process is traced particularly well by the ionized ISM, going through this process of the ionization of the local surroundings to the end phase of the stars. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of a background understanding on what different ionizing sources are acting within a disk and how we learn about those different processes. In the centers of disks, and many times there's an AGN contribution that contributes shocks and winds, both locally and on larger scales. Similarly, centrally concentrated, many galaxies have starbursts, which also can drive winds and shocks. Scattered throughout the disk are H2 regions. These are photoionized by massive O and B type stars. Similarly located, sort of scattered throughout the disk, you can identify supernova remnants. These are shocks associated with that sort of end phase explosion of the stellar evolution. Planetary nebulae are another end phase of stellar evolution where we see ionization very locally to these stars. And finally, by mass, there's a large population of older, low massive stars, and these have the potential also to contribute to some degree to the ionization across the disk. So although their contribution may be small, they're a significant component by mass. So this is a component that can't always be neglected. These different ionizing sources in the disk are really tracing different aspects of feedback. So the centralized sources are often associated with quenching and that sort of large scale halting of star formation. H2 regions are mostly acting fairly locally to be photoionizing their local surroundings and drive radiation pressure and winds. Supernova remnants contribute in a more mechanical way to the feedback in the disk, as well as to metal enrichment. And finally, these sort of older stars can contribute this pervasive low level of ionization. So how do we learn about all of these different components acting to ionize the disk. So one of the key tools is to look at different line ratios in the ionized component of the gas and look at diagnostic diagrams to try to dissect how these different processes are acting and understand the physics related to them. So this, for example, is a BPT diagram, which you probably have seen in some point in your career, where we look at the ratio of, for example, here this is oxygen 3 to H beta as a function of the nitrogen 2 to H alpha line emission or the sulfur 2 to H alpha line emission. And when we take individual measurements of this line ratio across a sample of thousands of different galaxies, we see some interesting, very discrete features appear in this diagram. So we see that there's a strong sequence where galaxies appear to be predominantly photoionized due to star formation. And we see this tail of regions moving out towards higher O3 to H beta line ratios due to a changing in the hardness of the radiation field. So this is typically attributed to an AGN contribution or to this sort of liner ionization. This is low ionization nuclear emission line regions where we see perhaps some AGN, obviously, but sort of enhancement in the hardness of the radiation field causing discrepant line ratios. Now, this sort of study was done decades ago for individual integrated spectra across galaxies. But now, as we move into more recent studies, we've started to look these diagrams broken up now into kiloparsec scale regions inside of individual galaxies. And when we do that, we see some very similar trends. Again, now this is a sample of about 600 galaxies with kiloparsecs. Each pixel is a kiloparsec sized region, or each point is a kiloparsec sized region. And so again, you see this sort of sequence of regions that are consistent with photoionization. But you see this wide cloud of regions that are not consistent with what we would expect from photoionization, but are also more prevalent than just a single nuclear source, potentially indicating there's a widespread component of low-level ionization, so suggesting this sort of region should be renamed from liner to something like Lyre. This has tentatively been associated with that older stellar population and contributing to the ionization widely across disks. Another physical process that can act to contribute to the ionization in the disk comes from shocks. So if we look again at the same diagnostic diagram, O3 to H beta, N2 to H alpha, or sulfur 2 to H alpha, we see that the photoionization sequence here, if we look at shock models, if we add increasing shock fractions from sort of 5% up to 80%, for shock velocities of 100 to 200 kilometers per second, we can see that this sort of range of models actually can cover very nicely the sort of discrepant regions here in a sample of luminous infrared galaxies where mergers and gas flows are causing widespread shocks across those galaxy disks. But in a similar way, shocks due to supernova or due to AGN contributions will be able to push pixels or regions in a galaxy in these diagnostic diagrams up into this regime. So these are the sort of tools that we use to try to understand and model the physics of what's happening inside of the galaxy disks. For much of my talk, I'm going to focus on what we can learn by studying in particular the H2 regions. This is related mostly to things like the radiation pressure, the winds they drive, their relation to star formation, and the metallicity, the gas phase, oxygen abundance that they're probing. Now, an H2 region is a region that's been photoionized by O and B type stars because these stars are massive and have short lifetimes. We typically expect to see that they are emitting an H alpha emission for only sort of the first 5 to 10 million years of their life. But we have to remember that these H2 regions are embedded within this ISM, this large scale extended ISM. So while the H2 region is photoionizing its local surroundings on sort of 10 to 100 parsec scales, it's sitting within, remember, this atomic gas and molecular gas ISM. So in some way, we can think of these H2 regions as tracer particles illuminating and ionizing their surroundings, but also informing us then about the physical conditions in the gas. And because we have some understanding of what physical conditions we expect, the sort of typical densities and temperatures we expect in these H2 regions, it gives us some leverage to infer more about the physical properties of the gas. So in particular, we can look at things like here, for example, this is again the nitrogen 2 to H alpha line ratio as a function of the gas phase oxygen abundance, metallicity. And this is from photoionization modeling. And you can see that there's quite some power in diagnostic lines like this to infer changes in the metallicity in the gas. This is a little bit more complicated, of course, because there are other conditions that can also affect this relation. So for example, here now in these photoionization models, they're colored by changes in the ionization parameter. So this is a way of parameterizing the ionization state of the gas and is defined as this ratio of the ionizing photon flux to the Strömgren radius of the ionized region and the density, the electron density of the region. So changes in both metallicity and ionization parameter can change your observed line ratios for any given set of sort of diagnostic line ratios. But with the addition of multiple different line ratios, we can actually get a really strong handle on how these different degenerate parameters are changing and actually do more concretely solve then for changes in both of these parameters. So here, for example, you can see that the sulfur 3 to sulfur 2 line ratio is a very clean diagnostic of changes in the ionization parameter. So with constraints observationally on changes in sulfur 3 to sulfur 2, we can feed that into our modeling, for example, with nitrogen 2 to H alpha to get very accurate measurements of changes in things like the metallicity in the gas. So in my talk, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the early results coming out of my group here in Heidelberg. I want to show you a little bit about what we've learned about the chemical abundance variations in nearby galaxies. I want to show you about some of the preliminary work relating the ionized ISM to the stellar sources, and then also connect that to the feedback processes and how that can inform us about molecular cloud dissolution. So all of the work I'll talk about in this talk has been done as part of the PHANGS collaboration. This is a group that's focused on studying the interplay of the small scale physics of gas and star formation with galactic structure and galaxy evolution. And this is a really large collaboration, but as you'll see highlighted in red, it has a strong component here in Heidelberg. So I'm sure many of you have heard talks already on PHANGS from your various local PHANGS enthusiasts. So the fundamental data set that we've been focusing on is a sample of 90 southern galaxies selected to be fairly nearby within about 20 megaparsecs, such that sort of ground-based 1 arcsecond seeing gives us about 50 to 100 parsec resolution. This is really crucial to isolating all the different key components of the star formation sequence. These are galaxies which are selected to be on or around the star forming main sequence. So here, if we look at star formation rate as a function of stellar mass, and they're all relatively face on so that we can isolate spatially as well, the different star forming regions. We're taking a three-prong approach to get at the physics of star formation and try to resolve the fundamental star forming units through the CO observations with ALMA of the molecular clouds. With optical spectroscopy, we look at the individual H2 regions. And with HST, we can pinpoint the individual ionizing star clusters. So together, this combination of different observatories gives us a really amazing handle on most of the key processes happening across this life cycle of baryons. Out of that parent sample of 90 galaxies that are all observed with ALMA, we have about half of them observed with HST, and about half of those are observed with MUSE. So there's 19 galaxies where we have this full complete data set In addition, we've had a JWST Treasury program approved, which will observe, again, this core sample of 19 galaxies. So to give you just a nice brief overview of the look at some of the data coming out of ALMA, you can see here the beautiful sort of wealth of information we have, not just about the morphology in the molecular gas and this sort of ability to break up a lot of this material into individual clouds, but we also have a rich kinematic data set to work with, tracing the disk dynamics on large scales. From the HST data, you can see here in blue, highlighting the near UV imaging we have, tracing really these youngest stars, which gives us a crucial handle on age dating these youngest clusters. And if we overlay onto this beautiful optical image, the ALMA data for this galaxy, you can see how really nicely the molecular gas is clearly associated with the dust lanes, which are seen so pronounced in that HST image. So there's a real amazing synergy between these data sets to understand all of these different components, not just of the stars, but also of the ISM. The data set that I've been working the most closely with comes from VLT MUSE observations of these sample of 19 galaxies. So this is an optical integral field spectrograph. That means for each pixel in this image, made up of 12 different MUSE, 12 different pointings, we have a full optical spectrum running from about 4,800 angstroms to 9,300 angstroms with a spectral resolution of about 2000, that's about 50 kilometers per second velocity resolution at H alpha. So we can see then at all of these positions a wealth of different emission lines, but also the stellar continuum traced through the spectroscopy. And this is done, as I said before, on nearby galaxies where we have the amazing ability to resolve spatially these individual star-forming regions. And we go deep enough that we can also put them in the context of their extended diffuse ionized gas. This is really an amazing multi-purpose data set. So from the stellar population fitting, we can constrain parameters like the stellar mass surface density at very high spatial resolution, as well as other parameters like the stellar age or the stellar metallicity. We can put that into context then with the ionized gas, here seen in a 3-color image. And from different spectrum at different objects, we see very distinctive, very different spectral features. For example, the H2 region here in purple shows very relatively narrow lines compared to supernova remnants, which have expanding shocked regions. We also see very clear differences in the line ratios, even by eye, where your AGN contribution shows very enhanced nitrogen 2 emission compared to H alpha, in contrast to what you see in H2 regions with much stronger H alpha contributions. So there's an amazing power in all of this to learn about all of these different ionizing sources. We can directly compare the kinematics from both the gas and the stars to get really detailed constraints on the gravitational potential and the different dynamical forces acting within these disks. And finally, as I mentioned before, we have this multi-wavelength view where we can also track how these different components are changing from the stars to the ionized gas to the molecular gas, for example, across a spiral arm. And with the spatial resolution that we can actually start to see interesting dynamical offsets between these different tracers. Here then is a look at where our PHANGS MUSE galaxies sit on the star formation rate stellar mass plane. So you can see they're again selected to be sort of tracing the star formation main sequence. And this is an incredible legacy data set with more than 1 million individual spectra, independent spectrum. This is over a factor of 2 more than what surveys that targeted thousands of galaxies like Manga, Sami, Khalifa have achieved with over an order of magnitude higher spatial resolution. So we've made this trade-off between number of galaxies that we're sampling for spatial resolution. Some of the key science goals in general for this project are to trace the star formation across different environments, to look at the timescales associated with star formation, We want to really aim to quantify the impact of stellar feedback. We want to map the chemical enrichment and mixing, and we want to connect all of these things on local scales with the large scale dynamics. So this is really leveraging the high spatial resolution combined with the wide maps across these galaxies. Just to show a little bit of a view of what these look like if I make a 3-color image colored by different optical emission lines, where you can see already very interesting differences in the colors of these maps. Much of this is dominated by changes in the metallicity across the map. So you can see radial trends in the color, tracing radial changes in the metallicity in the gas. We have a wide variety of different galaxy morphologies in our sample. One of the key things to point out is that we are planning a public data release for all of these derived products, these mosaic data cubes, by the end of the summer. So you should look for that coming hopefully sometime this month. So I'll come back around now to some of the science results that I wanted to highlight in this talk. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the chemical abundance variations we can now probe with this data set. So if we go from this optical view of the galaxy to an H-alpha view, we can see already by eye that there's a huge wealth of regions detected. Within this galaxy have spectroscopy for 2,000 independent H2 regions. That allows us to move from a view of metallicity variations like this, where we have maybe a sample of tens of regions, we can trace a radial changes in the metallicities, to a view like this, where we have thousands of data points. We can then start to explore much more subtle statistical correlations, and also not just be dominated by this strong radial trend, but start to look at azimuthal variations as well. So for a lot of the analysis that I've done, we start with looking at this first order strong radial gradient. We fit that and then subtract it in order to look at the residuals in the metallicity variations across the disks. So if we take this image in H-alpha and color code each of the regions by their metallicity, again, you see this very clear radial trend where you have enhanced metallicities in the center compared to the outskirts. If we subtract that gradient off, then you see a beautiful sort of picture emerging of all of these different variations azimuthally as well as radially in the disk. I should highlight here that the metallicity work that allows us to have such a huge sample across the disk, it relies on predominantly the strongest emission lines. So we have to make assumptions about the temperature and the density in the gas. However, there are fainter aurora lines which allow us to directly measure quantities like the temperature, the electron temperature in the H2 regions. And in fact, in our data set, we have hundreds of regions, often 100 regions or so within any individual galaxy, where we can actually directly make that measurement and calculate more detailed metallicities for those regions. But looking just at first at these strong line abundances across these large samples in the disks, looking at the azimuthal variations in a preliminary sample of 8 galaxies, we find that about half of them show significant azimuthal variations with interesting correlations with the spiral arms in these galaxies. So in many cases, we see enhanced abundances along a narrow ridge coordinated with where the spiral arm is located. Although in some galaxies, it's actually a decreased abundance along the spiral pattern. And we also find that this is often a very asymmetric feature. So in many of these galaxies, it was only on one spiral arm that we would see these really pronounced azimuthal trends in relation to the spiral structure. So this suggests it's a really complicated picture relating the enrichment processes to the disk dynamics and the mixing that's happening. Because, as I said, we were looking at these variations using the strong lines, where we had to make assumptions about the gas density and temperature. We did try to confirm this in some detail in one particular case. So this is one of the galaxies, NGC 1672, where along this spiral arm here to the east, we see a very narrow ridge of enhanced regions with enhanced abundances. So if I highlight that here in red, this agrees very well with where we see the molecular gas organized along this very narrow ridge. And so these enhanced abundances that we see in the strong line methods, we explored if we could reconfirm the changes in abundance by looking at changes in electron temperature in the gas. So regions with enhanced abundances have more metals, they're able to cool more efficiently. And indeed, what we found is along this ridge, the regions with electron temperature measurements all showed lower electron temperatures, suggesting they have higher abundances, they're more efficiently cooling. So this is a nice confirmation that the azimuthal trends that we are identifying are really physical and physically related to abundance variations. Now, going back to this picture of the metallicity variations, once we've or after we've already subtracted this radial trend, another feature that stands out is that we see, while maybe on sort of 3 kiloparsec scales, things look relatively evenly mixed. If we look on smaller sort of sub-kiloparsec scales, we see quite some increase in homogeneity. So we see that the red regions are sort of clustered with the red regions, the blue regions are clustered with the blue regions. And so we wanted to try to quantify this homogeneity and try to understand what that tells us about mixing in the disks. So first we looked at, as a function of scale, we looked at the scatter in the abundances that we would see. So as we looked at larger and larger scale, and on the smallest sort of sub-kiloparsec scales, what we found is that the scatter in abundances was significantly lower than as it was on sort of the 3 kiloparsec scales. And in general, the scatter was actually quite low. So systematically across these disks, we see scatter in the abundances of about 0.04 to 0.05 decks, which is actually really quite low. And the scatter on these very, very smallest scales drops to on the order of 0.2 or 0.02 or 0.03 decks, which is actually hitting the limits of our ability with this technique to measure changes in metallicity. So this is really, really quite an increased homogeneity on the small scales. So we normalized all of these trends by the sort of systemic scatter that we would see across the disk. And we also tried to test for the significance of this trend by assuming a null hypothesis. This is where we shuffled all of the measurements of metallicity across the whole disk. We randomized all of them and repeated the analysis. So that's shown here in gray. So you can see that this increased homogeneity is really statistically significant across all of the galaxies in this sample. These galaxies are color-coded by their stellar mass. So the reddish-orangish ones are the lowest mass galaxies, whereas the purple-blue ones are the higher mass galaxies. And we don't see any obvious trends with changes in stellar mass. Another way that we tried to quantify this change was to look at the 2-point correlation function of the metallicities, again, as a function of scale across each of these disks. And again, in comparison with the null hypothesis, where we've randomized all the metallicity values across the disks. And so what we see is that the H2 regions are correlated perfectly with themselves, and then they become less and less correlated as you go to large scales. But actually, they stay fairly highly correlated, even out to sort of kiloparsec scales across these disks. This is shown in comparison with the set of theoretical models that were published a few years ago by Krumholtz and Ting. This is a stochastically forced diffusion model where they have individual supernova injecting locally material, which then gets diffused and mixed out to larger scales. And one of the predictions from that model is that you should see some difference between spiral and dwarf galaxies, so basically with stellar mass. And while we don't see that breakdown by stellar mass, we do see in general a very good qualitative agreement between their prediction and our observations. So to quantify the mixing scale that we're seeing in these disks, we went ahead and measured the correlation at a 30% level across each of our galaxies. And we did that not just globally across the galaxies, but breaking each galaxy down into 2 kiloparsec wide rings. This is to sort of account for some of the radial variations as well. And what we find is that this 30% correlation scale shows no trends as a function of radius in the galaxies. And it shows some marginal correlation with changes in the star formation rate, surface density in these rings. But the strongest correlations we see are actually with the gas dispersion, so the gas velocity dispersion. So this is in comparison with the ionized gas velocity dispersion traced in H alpha, and here with the molecular gas velocity dispersion. Now the molecular gas is fairly concentrated into to low scale heights in the plane. If we try to correct for the difference in scale heights between the molecular gas and the ionized gas, which has slightly larger scale heights, we actually see very good agreement between these two parameters. So this suggests that it's really something about the turbulence in the ISM that's really playing a role in driving the correlation scales that we see. One final test that we did was to look for individually the scatter that we'd see in the abundances when we focus on just those H2 regions that seem to have reduced abundances compared to the radial gradient. And there we see that actually really nicely recovers the same sort of trend, this increase in homogeneity on small scales. If we play the same game looking at the H2 regions with enhanced abundances, we see that this actually goes away. So this suggests that it's actually mixing that's happening by dilution rather than pollution. And so the sort of picture that we're starting to form is that within some sort of galaxy, you have spiral arms. Perhaps you have some amount of localized enrichment happening to particles of gas as they pass through the inner arm region. They hit the spiral arm, you have an increase in general in star formation. So you can see then that there's these enhanced abundance regions. But then with the spiral arm passage, where you may have a lot of star formation driving turbulence, or in general, the spiral density wave causing increased turbulence, you get mixing, which is introducing material from either larger spatial scales or possibly even from larger scale heights in the disk to then decrease again the abundances locally in the ISM. So this is a really interesting view then of how the spiral arms and the spiral passage can play an important role in mixing. So within our group, we're also interested in understanding how these changes in the local physical conditions in the ISM can be related to the stellar sources that we see. So if we look at this beautiful image with PHANGS HST combined with our MUSE data, then we see we have a lot of ability zooming in to isolate these sort of individual stellar clusters and stellar associations and associate them with the ionized gas, with the ionization they're producing. We see a number of regions are clearly still sort of embedded in their ionized little bubble, while other regions have cleared more of their surroundings, and we can see more directly down to those young stars. From the HST photometry that we have, it's possible then to derive catalogs then of these stellar clusters and stellar associations with parameters like their stellar mass and age, the reddening suffered by the stars. So these are really amazing data sets then to join with what we are looking at in the ionized component of the ISM. So this is a project that my student, Fabian Scheuermann, has been working on, where he cross-matches here in blue, the associations, particularly highlighting, which you can see particularly well in the near UV HST imaging, cross-matching those with the H2 regions that we've identified from the MUSE H alpha. And so when we can sort of curate a sample of regions for which we have really good one-to-one agreement, we can start to look at things like how the predicted ionizing flux from that stellar population compares with the observed ionizing flux that we see from the MUSE data. And so a one-to-one line here shows that actually for most of these regions, there's some amount of radiation which is actually leaking out of the H2 region. So we find escape fractions on the order of 50 to 70%. This is actually in very good agreement of what's needed to actually ionize all that diffuse ionized gas that we see in the disks. So this is a really, really nice, consistent picture of how those ionizing sources are relating then not just locally to their H2 regions, but to these larger scales on ionization in the disk. Here, this is color-coded by changes in the ionization parameter. So right now we're investigating how changes in this escape fraction can also appear in relation to these other parameters in the local physical conditions. Another really interesting result that's come from this early work is comparing the reddening that we see in the stars from the HST SEDs to the reddening we see in the nebular emission lines from the Balmer decrement. And when we color code this by age, you see that the youngest associations and clusters actually follow very nicely along this 1-to-1 line, so that your stars are still embedded in their dusty regions where they've formed. As these sources get older, you see that the reddening suffered by the stars actually drops in relation to what the sort of nebular reddening is tracing in the dust on the larger scales. So you can see basically how these young regions are destroying some of their natal material and actually sort of becoming revealed in the galaxy. So this shows that there's a really amazing potential to try to use these HST star clusters as a tracer of the timeline related to the star formation process. So this is still really some early work. So look for this paper in the coming year. My postdoc, Oleg Egorov, has also been doing some interesting work matching the ionization that we see with the ionizing sources. But he's coming at it from a slightly different approach, looking at sort of larger scale features. So if we look at this galaxy here with this beautiful spiral feature, and we look at some subsection of the spiral arm, what Oleg noticed was that in some of these regions where we have actually location between some of the brightest H2 regions, we see that the velocity dispersion in the ionized gas goes up, and that this actually has some interesting correlations with the positions of the HST sources. So we seem to be seeing somehow these sources driving these bubble formation within the ISM. And when he looks at the energy that you would, the kinetic energy that's being injected in these bubbles on these larger scales in relation to the stellar mass of the clusters, of the stellar clusters, we see a correlation emerging between these two measurements with a bit of a plateau at lower stellar mass, which may be due actually to the instrumental velocity resolution limitations of the MUSE data. But it's a really tantalizing trend then, where we can think we start to see something about the kinetic energy being injected from these sources into the gas. Interestingly, these also seem to show very distinctive line ratio diagnostics here in this BPT diagram. Again, this is O3 to H beta as a function of nitrogen 2 to H alpha and sulfur 2 to H alpha. So these bubbles seem to show again, these line ratios suggestive of harder ionization acting, perhaps shocks relating to this feedback. So again, this is really, really exciting preliminary work from Oleg since he joined my group a few months ago. This relates to the third point I wanted to touch on. This is our attempts to begin to quantify the feedback acting in the ISM and how it relates to the molecular cloud dissolution. So as I said earlier, if we look at where we see the H alpha, these young massive stars in the disk, in relation to where we see the molecular clouds, the CO, in some regions they sort of line up, but in many parts of the disk, there's this really distinctive offsets between the two tracers. So you see that along the spiral arms, particularly in some key regions of the spiral structure, you can see that the time sequence of the star formation process becomes really apparent. So as material sort of enters into this spiral arm, it's able to condense into these molecular clouds, which form stars, and then it's that last generation of stars that you see on the trailing side of the arm. So there's really an amazing ability then to track a lot of the progress of star formation. And what's particularly interesting is that if you look at where look at the star formation rate associated with any given molecular cloud. In Milky Way studies, where they've typically focused on individual star-forming regions and asked how much molecular gas is, they tended to find that the molecular clouds in the Milky Way seem to be very efficient at forming stars. They had where they would basically use up all of their molecular gas in very short timescales. But when we tried to repeat this analysis in one of our nearby galaxies in PHANGS, what we see is that because on these small scales, much of the H-alpha emission is clearly spatially offset from the CO gas. There's clear that it's very difficult to trace individual clouds that are still being destroyed by their stars. So there's a few of these regions where we see spatially coincident, the H-alpha and the CO emission, but in most cases there's a spatial offset. And so when we cross-match catalogs of the H2 regions and the GMCs, out of a sample of thousands of regions, we actually find a very small fraction where they're actually spatially coincident. This suggests that this feedback process, destroying those natal clouds, must be very efficient and relatively quick. And that this sort of unbiased view across these galaxies returns very different answers in terms of the timescales associated with star formation and the efficiency associated with star formation. Now, my postdoc, Liz Watkins, has had an interesting idea to come at this by looking not just at one-to-one correlations, but directly at the morphology of the CO. So if these stellar clusters, for example, here are feeding back into the ISM, what you might not see is a one-to-one spatial coincidence, but you might see actually a bubble forming in the molecular gas. So she went through our sample of galaxies and looked specifically then for these features of bubbles being formed around HST star clusters. And she identified these bubbles not just through their morphology in the CO, but as well also through their kinematics. So if you step through the velocity channels in the CO emission, what you'll see is that actually within a relatively narrow range of channels, this very clear ring emerges. And if you have your intensity contrast cranked up on your screen, you may see as well that there's a little bit perhaps of the approaching or the receding side of the bubble that's apparent even in the center of this bubble. So putting together this sample selected from the HST and ALMA data provides a really unique leverage on understanding how these clusters are feeding back into the gas. And we're working right now to try to integrate some of the MUSE spectroscopy in that, in particular trying to look for indications of supernova contributions to some of this feedback. But across our sample of 15 galaxies that she's looked at so far, she has identified something like 30 bubbles, again, suggesting this is a relatively rare process in feedback, but that with our sample, our wide areas and high resolutions, we can start to amass a large enough sample to look statistically at these processes. And again, this is selected not just by the morphology, but also through the kinematics in the CO. That means then you can begin to model and constrain some of the energy and momentum input into the molecular gas, which is exactly what Liz has done. So she's looked at, in these bubbles, she's derived the dynamical age needed to form that bubble in the molecular gas, and she's compared that with the HST star cluster ages. And we find really tantalizing correlations between these two, and a large number of regions that have relatively young ages, such that suggests that there could be a significant contribution from pre-supernova feedback acting to form these bubbles in the molecular gas. So I hope I've given you a nice overview of some of the projects that my group here in Heidelberg has been working on, and how this is informing us about the life cycle of baryons, not just sort of across galaxies, but on small scales within galaxies. And I just want to take 1 minute to talk as well about some of the next projects that I'm excited about. In particular, there's a lot of the physics that's happening sort of within the H2 regions at these interfaces from the internal processes in the H2 regions with the external ISM. And a lot of the shock networks that are being driven in the ISM, these are all happening on relatively small spatial scales that we actually can't quite access with PHANGS. So to make progress, we really would like to get to sort of these sub 10 parsec scales. It means we have to look at really nearby targets. But as I've also shown, it's really crucial to connect these small scale physics to the large scale picture of what's happening in the ISM to understand how it connects both in regulating the smart star formation process, but also in driving sort of galaxy evolution on large scales. So that means for these nearby targets, you need to cover a really wide area with a dedicated survey. And that's exactly what SDSS-5 is planning to do. So the local volume mapper is an optical IFU campaign that moves from, what things like Manga, Khalifa, Sami, these other surveys have done on kiloparsec scales. PHANGS can sort of start to probe on 50 to 100 parsec scales, but LVM is really targeting these sub 10 to 10, smaller than 10 parsec scales in the local group. So our survey is targeting a large portion of the plane of the Milky Way, as well as the LMC and SMC, a large area within Orion, and then a sort of distributed grid across the sky to trace some of this extended ionized, diffuse ionized gas component in our own Milky Way. And the reason we are able to do this is we are building a new telescope, a new instrument that will have 1,800 fibers, which are fed into 16-centimeter telescopes. So these will provide 40 arcsecond spaxels on the sky with a field of view almost as large as the full moon. And we take this input from the 16-centimeter telescope and we feed it into 3 amazing DESI spectrographs. So this is a new instrument, a new telescope, a new facility that we're building currently at LCO, with the hope for first light sometime next year. So this is a project which I'm heavily involved in and I'm very excited about. So you should definitely keep your eyes open in the coming years for results from this. So I'll leave you here with my conclusions. So I've shown you something about the chemical abundance variations that we're observing across nearby galaxies. We see distinctive azimuthal variations, but we also see very interesting kiloparsec scale homogeneity in the metallicities, indicative of efficient mixing. We're starting to relate the ionized ISM to the stellar sources with some hope that we can anchor the timeline for the process happening in star formation by leveraging some of the HST stellar constraints. And finally, we're starting to quantify the feedback processes that are happening in its relation to the molecular cloud dissolution with some interesting preliminary evidence for pre-supernova feedback playing a really important role. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That certainly was a very detailed view, and it's just amazing how much complexity and interesting connections there are between all the different wavelength regimes. I would like to open the floor for questions. So if people should put their hands up, please, or alternatively type their questions into the chat. And first question comes from Andrew Winter.
Hi, Kathryn. That was really nice talk. So I was wondering about the correlations and the dispersions that you were getting in the metallicities, and I was wondering. I think you touched on this briefly, but maybe I missed it a little bit. How dependent are these on the assumed temperatures of your regions that you get, and do the models then change potentially the correlation functions you get?
Yeah. So the results that we find here in terms of the homogeneity are actually quite robust to our choice of metallicity calibration that we use. So we essentially don't find any difference in this fundamental. I mean, quantitatively there's some differences, but qualitatively we find this homogeneity using any different prescription to measure the metallicity. So this result is actually quite robust to all of these assumptions about changes in temperature and density. In general, the azimuthal variations is a little bit of a different story. The prescription, in some detail, the prescription that we're choosing to use for our work is this Pelukin and Grable 2016 S calibration. We have a limited range of metallicity prescriptions available And because MUSE actually is a red spectroscopic instrument, so there's a number of lines in the blue that we don't have access to. And this prescription actually says it uses a wide range of different line ratios, seems to be quite robust to these degeneracies between changes in metallicity and ionization parameter. If we compare that with another calibration, the Doppler 2016 calibration, that also uses a large number of line ratios to derive metallicities. This calibration is based on photoionization modeling, whereas the Disillusion and Grable calibration is actually based on empirical relations, where people have actually directly gone and measured electron temperatures for some set of regions and empirically derived a relation. We find that the sort of the outliers in one are the outliers in the other, right? So the things with enhanced abundances agree to a large degree. And so that gives us quite some confidence that the azimuthal trends we're seeing are real and physical. This is not the case for every single metallicity prescription. So some of these, O3 N2 is really relying only on that line ratio. The N2, this is an N2H alpha line ratio. So these are using fewer line ratios basically to derive the metallicities. And while sort of in a broad sense, you know, the metallicity gradients or sort of the overall metallicities you measure sort of are generally in agreement, but the details of the azimuthal, the trends, once you fit and subtract that radial gradient, a lot of that is lost basically due to these ionization parameter degeneracies. So we're really quite confident in our results. Although, of course, we're really keen to confirm this further by measuring directly those electron temperatures and revisiting some of this with those detailed measurements. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Andreas?
Yeah, Kathryn, thank you very much. Very good, very interesting talk. So I have a question about these azimuthal variations in the abundances of this scatter of 0.1 dex. Is that a sign of different phases of star formation at that radius? Or is that really a variation in abundances which ends up in a scatter in the stellar population abundance later on that radius?
Yeah. So we think it's a real physical change in the metallicities in the gas. But let me bring up, I think this one again. So, you know, often these features are really quite they can be quite narrow in the disk. And so the role that this would play in, for example, like the stellar abundances, I know for, you know, things like chemical tagging in the disk, there's some assumption that all of the regions have formed sort of at a uniform metallicity. We think that that shouldn't actually play a huge role because the dominant variations in metallicity is this first order radial gradient. That's still the dominant change. Let me show this figure again, actually, because maybe more helpful. Right, so the sort of radial sort of linear gradient is still the dominant effect. And we do think that this scatter to a large degree is physical, but that it's mostly concentrated into some of these sort of narrow features, like along the spiral arm ridge.
Yeah. Anyway, very interesting, yeah, because the scatter is very small, yeah, only 0.1 dex, yeah, is a really small variation at the same point. So that's very good for our modeling, yeah, of stellar populations. Thank you.
Absolutely.
If I may, I just have a question myself. Yeah, this is just I find it remarkable that you've got so small variation in the metallicity around azimuth in different parts of the galaxy at the same radius. Does that actually also put potentially some constraint on the star formation efficiency? Because, you know, if you've got a packet of gas and and a larger fraction of that gas forms stars, then you might expect a little bit locally more metals compared to the total amount of gas. Is that a factor which can come into this?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I mean, so one of the things I didn't show, I don't think I have a slide actually, is that when we looked at the regions with the enhanced abundances relative to the gradient, We did find some interesting, weak but existing correlations with things like CO, column density at that, along that line of sight. Now we don't expect that the CO we're seeing is at the position of the H2 region, because by design that they shouldn't be entirely spatially coincident, but the regions with enhanced abundances did seem to be sitting very close to CO clouds, and they did show a slight increase in their overall reddening. So there is a tentative trend to see that these enhanced regions might be somewhat more contained somehow. But again, then you need some history of star formation to have sort of pre-enriched that material so that you can see it now as being more enriched in abundance. And so that suggests then you have to have, at least one, we from our modeling, it seemed like maybe one generation of star formation might be enough to increase the abundances by this very small amount. So there's 0.05 dex in order to actually see be consistent with these azimuthal trends. But what we'd like to do is actually sort of compare in more detail with the stellar populations that we see to understand if that's consistent with there being maybe a, not too far in the past previous generation of stars, which might have pre-enriched that material.
All right, thanks. That's really interesting. I think we've got time for one more question in the main session. We'll have an opportunity to discuss further with Kathryn afterwards in a more informal way. So I'll ask Caroline to ask a question.
Thanks very much. That was super interesting. I was also interested in the point you made about the spiral arms contributing to the mixing. And yeah, just wondering, are actually all of the targets in the sample, all of the galaxies grand design spirals, or are there any changes with morphology in the sample?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have a range of morphologies. I can show this image again. So some of these galaxies are much more flocculent than others. Others have very, very strong bars. Actually, about half of our sample is a very strong bar. A number of them are very clear grand designs. So far, we've only looked in detail at the things like the azimuthal abundance variations in that initial sample of 8 galaxies. So this year, we should be investigating in more detail how this relates to sort of the large scale morphological types of the galaxies. But there's been, Tom Williams at MPIA has been looking at this to some degree, using actually a slightly more involved technique where he interpolates between the measurements and the metallicities we have in order to get a full map of the abundance variations. And what he finds is that there are some interesting correlations with the galaxy star formation rates, but I think he doesn't find anything pronounced with the changes in morphology. So this is definitely ongoing work. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Okay, then before we thank Kathryn, I've just got one announcement to make, and to do that, I will share the screen. I'll just take this here, share, and that is next week's talk, which I will advertise here. We will have Ryan Cook, who's actually also, he will be talking about local universe dwarf galaxies and what they tell us about metal injection and the relation to Big Bang nucleosynthesis. And so that's what Ryan will be talking about next week at the same time. So it just remains for me to ask everybody to open their microphones and their videos, and let's give Kathryn a great send-off for this very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Kathryn.